Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our meeting here tonight. And we'll get to our topic shortly. A few other things we want to do first. We're honoured to have the Bishop of the Church here tonight. Welcome. Now, next meeting in May, History Month, Dr. Greg Lockwood will be our guest speaker on the Sherman diaries. He's put a colossal amount of work into translating those diaries, and his book focuses on the diaries in South Australia, in Adelaide and Port Lincoln. It's produced into a book and is published by Wakefield Press, and hopefully it'll be available at our meeting in May, but it's sort of in that sort of time frame. So there's a lot of information about his talk in the FoLA newsletter, and the meeting is on 22nd of May here. So we encourage you to come to it. It'll be live streamed as it is tonight, and we hope that we get a good attendance. Sometimes with news that we get on email, we just sort of pass by pretty quickly and don't think any more about it. But there's one that I got on the April the 9th, and many other people would have too, where Rachel announced that she's resigning as director of the Lucerne Archives. And so quite a few people already know about it. I had permission from her today to announce it tonight, and she's an apology for tonight's meeting, but she wants to come to our May meeting and speak and sort of express her thanks to FoLA at that meeting. But she finishes up at the archives on the 27th of May, and then she's taking up a new position at Australian Lutheran World Service in Adelaide. So it'll be something quite different for her. She's been at the archives for 16 years, and in more recent years has been our director and been highly respected in that role. So to me it came as a great shock, and it probably did to everybody else who read that email as well. But we need to respect her decision to find a new direction in life. And we're fortunate we've still got 3 very capable archivists at the Lucerne Archives to sort of keep everything running after that. And it's up to the leaders of the church to find a new director of the archives. So I'm not too sure how many of you knew about that, but that's what has happened. There's lots of other activities in History Month, and some of them, quite a few of them are listed in our newsletter, and you're most welcome to read that. I also received an email from Sam Daring, and he's got a whole lot of projects that he's doing during History Month as well. And if you look on his website, website you'll find, he's got a whole list of things that he's doing. What's the point of what?
That's one of his talks.
Oh, I haven't got them all here. There's
That's the one about past church.
Okay. I had a look through, but I didn't bring all the information with me tonight. But it's just interesting that when he gave a talk here to FoLA about the Neil's Flat churches, which is sort of something a bit different really, I had a look on the Archives website, and there's been over 500 people that have viewed that talk. Over 500 for a little place like Neil's Flat. It's absolutely amazing. So, also we encourage members, both here and those who might be watching live stream, to pay your subs if you haven't already done so. There's still a lot of subs outstanding, and we've still got some time yet, but we endeavour to do what we can to support the Lutheran Archives, and a lot of the money we accumulate is through subs. So if anybody hasn't paid their subs, either here or live stream customers, we encourage you to do that as soon as possible and make contact with Shirley. We've also benefited from a bequest from Helen Gordon, her estate, and some money has gone into our account already, and according to the executors, there's still more money that could be coming our way, and it's very kind of her in her lifetime to think of us, and so what's it, 23,000 something or other that's come our way in quite recent times. But they say there's still more to come. So I think we'll move on to our topic for tonight. Before I do, considering the nature of the topic, I'd like to begin to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and also like to pay our respects to elders past and present. Now I call on Dr. Dean Sweck to introduce our speaker.
Elizabeth and I agree that this should be brief. So Elizabeth Buck nee Eckermann. Elizabeth is a daughter of Pastor Clem and Mrs. Norma Eckermann, and she has a number of siblings. Not quite sure how many. 5. As a child, Elizabeth lived at Koonibba. Or is it Koonibba? Because I heard Aboriginal people saying Koonibba. From 1960 to 1965. As with many other MKs, do you know what that is? Missionary kids. So missionary kids actually muck up more than pastors' kids. They do. Elizabeth, you didn't. Elizabeth was deeply influenced by that experience in her early life. She and her sister Norma were much involved in the publishing of their father's memoir, which is called The Mission and the Nunga People. Good. Is it out there? Oh, okay. Elizabeth's career was largely as a public servant, working in the Health Insurance Commission that set up Medibank, now known as Medicare. She did a good long stint in Canberra and later returned to Adelaide. I know that Elizabeth was also the office administrator at Bethlehem in more recent years, and her efficient, helpful and friendly manner was much appreciated. Elizabeth is married to Matthew, who's taking a back pew just behind her, and they have 3 adult children. 3? I put up my hand for this introduction because I'm interested in Koonibba. My grandparents, Ernst and Concordia Appold, were missionaries there more than 100 years ago. My mother spent her first years of life there, and Dorothy, my wife, taught there in the 60s. And there were kids from at Concordia from Koonibba. There's the Eckermann kids were there, and I can remember Bobby Highfold and Pam Coleman, who's excellent in basketball, and other Aboriginal kids, and they all endeared themselves to us. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elizabeth.
Am I coming through? Okay. I'm not usually mic'd up, and I certainly haven't used one of these clickers before, so I hope it'll go okay. First of all, it's a joy to be here to talk to you about Koonibba, a place that is very dear to my heart and that of my family, being the family of Pastor Clem Eckermann, who spent more than 50 years in his relationship with the Koonibba people. As Dean said, I'm one of the mission kids, and I was having a conversation with Lois Traeger, one of the Traeger children, about Koonibba reminiscing, and she said something very simple but very profound. We all lived together, we were all the same. And this perfectly reflects what it was like living at Koonibba. We lived in a community where we had different skin colours, different ways of doing things, but it didn't matter. The differences were just accepted. And we were living in a Christian community where we all knew that we were God's children. I and my siblings love living at Koonibba. In this talk, I'd like to give an overview of the history of the mission, and then give you a first-hand lived experience of Koonibba Mission, and if time permits, challenge the academic intellectual concept that missions by their very nature must be destructive. Okay, is this clicker going to work? Yes. I will draw on some material from my father's book, which Dean referred to. Okay. Koonibba is located 26 miles or 42 kilometres northwest of Ceduna. In the 1960s, a very remote location, just a dirt track off of Highway 1 leading to the Koonibba Gate. Here we go. An entry into the mission. A hot, dry climate with lots of flies. Just leave that for a minute. In the late 1800s, the ELCA resolved to establish a mission on the west coast that was born of their deep concern for the plight of the Aboriginal people. The mission aims were ambitious. As well as proclaiming the gospel, it was to provide suitable employment for the adults, provide for the physical and spiritual needs of the sick, disabled and aged, and to establish a school to instruct the children. These welfare objectives were going to be far-reaching and beyond the resources of the mission, and there would be no support from the government. Okay. On the 24th of August 1897, an important Aboriginal man, Willis Michael Laurie, trudged through the bush with Pastor Kempe, and Mickey chose the spot that became Koonibba. The old folk recounted the beginnings of the Koonibba to my father as the day the scrub all fell down, and that beautiful photo shows them there at work. The mission officially began in 1901 when Pastor Claude Weebish came from the USA. He served at Koonibba for 15 years, and despite the early wanderings of the Aboriginal people coming and going, by the time his term was finished, all the principal buildings had been built. What shone through in those early days was the tireless efforts of the staff to care for the physical needs of the people. That won the trust of the local people. The old people spoke of Pastor Weebish as simply, he was a great man, he was a great man. Now, the Koonibba community is not made up of just one tribe. As well as the local Wirangu tribe, there are also significant numbers from 5 other regions, including the Gugatha people of the Gawler Ranges. And because of the language, I've skipped, how do I go back? Because of the language problems, Pastor Weebish decided to use English as the common language. That was criticised by some people, But that was the decision that had been made at that time. Okay. Right. As Dean said, Pastor Appelt served from Koonibba from 1916 to 1920, and these were the war years, and very difficult time with the suspicion of anything German. The state government actually tried to take the mission over by stealth with no recompense to the Lutheran Church, but Pastor Wiebisch foiled that plot. And from that point on, there was always a very uneasy relationship between church and state. Pastor Jewers joined Pastor Appelt as an assistant pastor, and he stayed on then. And Pastor Hoff took over in 1920 and served to 1930. Some of you would have known his children, Naomi, Olga and Lothar. Pastor Hoff was very good at languages, and he transcribed the local Wirangu language, which the family has published and has been preserved. This work was crucial for the older people hearing the gospel in their own language, and this was a time of sowing the seed. However, the mission was in debt to the tune of £15,000 due to particularly to droughts. The church took the courageous decision to pay off that debt. They had a national campaign to raise the funds. However, full employment at the mission for the men was simply not possible, and they had to make changes to try and make the mission financial. That meant that some of the Koonibba men would have to move off-site to find employment, and there was a significant period of unhappiness and discontent, which I think you can understand with those changes. Some tracts of lands were leased off for share farming. Pastor Hoff was dearly loved, and he remained a lifelong friend of the mission. Pastor Muller served from 1930 to 1936, and I think some of you would have known his children, Ruth Matisky and Dr. Myrna Miller, the famous legendary GP from Sejuna. Pastor Muller bore the fruit of Pastor Hoff's work, and many of the old camp people came forward to be baptised. And this was also the beginnings of the mission car driving out to where some of the Koonibba people had moved, even if temporarily, to find work. Pastor Traeger took over in 1936 and serving through to 1946. And some of you would know some of his children, Pastor Clem, and of course Lois and Naomi still worship at Bethlehem. He had to work under the financially pared down reconstructed mission, which meant that the pastor also had to be the superintendent, and which included first 14 job titles and descriptions. It was an incredible workload. During this time, the hospital was built, and that was terrific for additional care for the Koonibba people. A new school building was also built because of the increasing number of pupils, and the regular up-the-road trips became part of the pastor's workload. Now, my father comes in, you can only see him just in the corner. My father comes into the Koonibba story in 1941. He was ordained there at the young age of 21 years, and he spent 2 valuable years working under Pastor Traeger as an associate pastor and teacher. When Pastor Traeger left, my father then accepted the call to Koonibba, serving from 1946 to 1943, and this was when 4 of my oldest siblings were smaller children. They described those years as a very happy time. I've just got a few photos there of some of the confirmation classes. I think the one for the staff photo, I missed that one. Okay. And that's one of the mothers and babies. Regular down-the-line trips now became part of the pastor's workload as well. Now, it was during this term in June 1952, my father received a phone call from Adelaide advising the Koonibba Mission run by the UAM was closing on the Monday, and the staff leaving on the Tuesday. This was a phone call on the Friday. Could they get to Aldea by Monday? That's 300 kilometres northwest of Koonibba, and bring the people down south. He accepted that challenge, and with the help of many of the local farmers, Lutheran farmers in the district, they took trucks and they brought the Aldea people down. Eventually that Yalata would become their home, and within less than a year's time the atomic bombs were being dropped on their lands at Maralinga. Now between 1953 and 59, 3 different pastors served at Koonibba: Rosenblatt, Temi and Heydrich. Now things did not go well during this period of time, and Koonibba was in the doldrums. My father was called back to Koonibba and came back and served from 1960 to 1965. These were the years of my childhood there. Before I take you to 1960s Koonibba, I need to go back to the early days. I mentioned that it was always difficult working with the government. In 1912, the Protectorate Act came into effect. This gave the state-appointed protector power to take from its parents any half-caste child, that is, any Aboriginal child who was not a full-blood. The protector made it very clear that he meant to use the full powers of the Act. Pastor Wiebisch travelled to Adelaide to voice his protest and plead Koonibba's case. But all he got from the government officials was an admission that their plans would greatly embitter the Aborigines against the government. Many of the children at Koonibba were not full-blood. My father wrote, "The news from Pastor Wiebisch on his return to Koonibba was heard with great dismay and concern. The people and mission staff sat down and eventually they decided, with the full approval of the concerned parents, to build a children's home." Come on. Okay, where are we now? We've lost it, have we? Sorry. Here we are. To build a children's home at Koonibba. Only children voluntarily placed in the care of the home. Only children placed voluntarily in the care of the home by their parents would be admitted, a basic rule that continued through all the years of the home's existence. They deliberately did this to circumvent the state legislation. Parents had 2.5 hours per day to spend with their children at the home to maintain family bonding. A nursing matron and staff looked after the children in the home. Many young single Lutheran women went to Koonibba to help out at the home, and they have some wonderful stories. The older girls in the home would buddy up and look after the younger children, and a lovely lady that I knew, Hilda Bennett, who grew up at the children's home, she told me what she used to do as one of the big girls looking after the little girls. What a sacrifice for those first parents. Can you imagine what that must have been like? I wouldn't say the solution was ideal, but it meant there was no stolen generation at Koonibba. The home saved the children. No children were ever removed from Koonibba. Neither were any children forcibly removed from their parents and put in the home. It was not possible. It was entirely voluntarily. At some stages at the home, a married couple looked after the running of the home rather than a matron, and certainly in the 1960s when I was there, it was Mr. and Mrs. Kruger had oversight of the... Now, I'm just going to flip through some photos from the... if I can get it to work. We're not playing ball. Yes. It's got some photos showing various. Okay. Playing ball. Yep. Okay. However, good came out of this evil act, and over time, the home became a part boarding school, enabling children to receive an education. Aboriginal children were not permitted to attend state schools. That breakthrough only came in the early 1950s. I'm really not having a very good job. Okay, I've gone a bit far, but we'll just leave it for that. Families from far afield, in some cases 3 generations of children were successively sent to Koonibba so that they could receive an education. At times, there was a waiting list for the home. My father focused particularly on the first generation of Koonibba residents, the leaders in the first 15 years of the mission, who chose to make Koonibba their home, many of whom he personally knew. Together with Willis Michael Laurie, there were a whole group of outstanding individuals, most especially the life of Patrick Henry Nandy, lame Paddy. Born with deformed legs, just stumps, he was brought to Koonibba as a young man. He had a remarkable life matched by remarkable faith. He worked alongside my father as an evangelist. This first generation were well spoken and they wanted their children to be educated. Jimmy Richards was the blacksmith who sang hymns while he worked, and he built that first Koonibba church. They were hardworking and self-supporting in various trades and occupations, stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, shearers. Okay. All right, we'll just keep going. Shearers. There is a particular photo that I would like to show you if I can get it to work. Any reason why we're not getting advance? Okay, shearing shed, saddlery workshop. One of my favourite photos, the working men of Koonibba 1920. These are the proud men who did much to build Koonibba, and it's one of my favourite photos. Right. But most of all, most important of all, my father wanted the descendants of these people to know of their great faith. The strength and conviction of their Christian faith was quite outstanding. It absolutely blows me away. They wanted to share their faith with their own people, and they too became missionaries. The pastor said that the people themselves were the best missionaries, people like Charlie Kelly and Patrick Nandy. There were instances of people literally walking in from the desert, requesting and in some cases demanding immediate baptism, having heard the gospel from their kinfolk. They did have to do instruction. Instead of being full of despair and resentment, they felt they were making real gains in their lives and they were actively building their community. They had found a priceless treasure, the gospel of Jesus Christ. My father wrote, Jesus set them free from many deep fears and all the darkness in their lives. When there were setbacks, they did not fall away. They stood tall and strong in their faith and strode forward. There was a deep affection, love and respect between the people and those who served at the mission that spanned the generations and the decades and the successions of pastors and staff. Anyone who lived at Koonibba can attest to that fact. Black and white were drawn together by our shared humanity, sharing joys and sorrows. In those early days, the death of 2 of the farm manager's children and little Waldemar Wiebisch, together with the death of Hilda Coleman in childbirth, the daughter of Jimmy Richards, drew the community together tightly. The focal point of the church of Koonibba is Our Redeemer Lutheran Church, opened there in 1910, now a heritage listed building. You see the gospel as soon as you walk into the church. God will have all men to be saved. And then the altar of Jesus with his arms outstretched. That altar made a very strong impression on me, as it did most of the other children. And there is a beauty about that altar that is just so very, very precious to me. Right. When I asked my siblings, when you think of Koonibba, what is the first thing you think of? They all said the same thing, the hymn singing of the people in the church. They loved their hymns and they sung with joy and fervour. And at Koonibba, What a Friend We Have in Jesus was their favourite hymn, All Our Sins and Griefs to Bear. Now I'm going to talk about the 1960s, what it was like there in my memories. My father described these years as the golden years, and I've got a few photos here showing you this is an old cottage. There were old and new cottages, and I'll put this one up here. Behind, from the manse, you could look out and see all these, and up the top was Emu Ridge. It wasn't a big mountain, but it was Emu Ridge. In the 1960s, if you looked out on that ridge, you'd see little puffs of smoke, and at night time, if you looked out, there'd be little red glows on the ridge, and that is where the old people who still like to be in their whirly tents, that's where they lived. We had electricity, a generator for a couple of hours a day. We had kerosene lanterns at night. The earliest photo I can find from 1960 there is some of the staff outside the Koonibba Hall. A couple of those, one of those little pipsqueaks there is me. This is our famous colour photo. My older siblings, particularly my sisters, were at Concordia College, and then Brother John and then Brother Robert also joined them at Concordia College. The two male teachers at that stage were Dean Heine and Peter Baker, and they were really part of our family because they ate with us every evening, and my mother always did their washing for them. The return of my parents lifted the spirits of the community, and that was centred around the congregational life. Church attendances were very high. I can't get it to work. Okay. All right, we'll just give it a miss for a minute. It's coming back. Oh, good. Church attendances were very high. There were devotions held in cottages and in the halls. Of course, there were confirmation lessons, Sunday school, occasionally women's guild and a ladies' choir. We'll just run through those. Now, my father at that time introduced a policy of self-determination and self-government to build up the people's self-esteem. The community met every Monday night to discuss issues, make decisions, and then they would implement them. It gave the people a voice, and it did work, and they had a say in how things were being done. Okay, I'm a bit stuck here. The mission took back the sheep from the share farmers, and under Edmund Ware's, they had a building program, a voluntary building program. They did all sorts of improvements around Koonibba, and Edmund Ware took over the sheep from the share farmers, and the sheep quality improved and the books went from the red into the black. But what I can tell you is that the social life at Koonibba was buzzing. The Sunday night Luther League meeting, originally for the Ruth, became a community family night. Aboriginals from far and wide came to join in, as did some of the young folk from the district. There was square dancing, film strip devotions, country and western music, also comedy skits. It was terrific. Something was happening every afternoon in the hall. The marching girls would have their practice sessions. There was Junior Luther League. The musicians had tape recording sessions. There were women's arts and crafts, gym nights for the boys, and the weekly picture show. I loved the picture nights. And there it is set up, ready to go. And then there was sports. Netball, volleyball, softball, kids cricket, and the big one, football. Koonibba had immense pride in their football and netball teams, and that pride was well placed. The Koonibba Football Club is one of the oldest Indigenous clubs in Australia. They celebrated their centenary in 2005. Sport was very important in building relationships with the wider community. One of my father's favourite pastimes was watching the Koonibba football matches. Household names such as Wanganeen, Burgoyne, Davey, Betts, Millera and others all trace back to Koonibba. And those footballers, they all trace back to Koonibba. Most of them to the great Dick Davey, but that's another story. The Koonibba school was at capacity, and one of the rare positives from the government was that from 1950 onwards, every student who achieved the qualifying certificate at the primary level received government support to attend Concordia College. So quite a few Koonibba students went to Concordia, and their communities have benefited from their skills and leadership from going to Concordia. Okay. Oh, okay. All right. Koonibba was a very happy place for children. The number one thing to do was to climb trees. And even at the near the manse, there was a clump of trees with a huge rope, and we would swing from one tree to the other like Tarzan style. Playing marbles. If you didn't have real marbles, that's okay. You just use quandong seeds and away you went. The playground was very popular. People spent a lot of time there. The stump heap in the background, you can see a large stump heap. Now that stump heap was between the manse and the children's home, and we spent hours climbing on that stump heap. However, occasionally the cows would roam around, and on more than one occasion we would be on the stump heap playing, and we would look up and there's a bull staring straight at you, and so then you had to make a very quiet retreat. I just want to tell just one story from my childhood. I found life as a 4-year-old very boring because big sister Ruth had gone to school. It was just me and my mother, and she was always busy. One day I decided I'd go over and see my father. It was ration day, and all particularly the old people, went over to the children's home. They had their sugar bags, their sugar Hessian bags, and they would go there and they'd get tea, flour, sugar, tobacco, and things like that. My father was chatting with an old man named Bobby Queema. Bobby looked at me when I came. He looked at me. He had a long grey beard, a chulpi. He looked at me and he said, "Elizabeth, you're so pretty. I'm going to take you in. I'm going to put you in my sugar bag and take you home." I looked at the beard. I looked at the sugar bag, and I turned and I bolted. I ran and ran as fast as I could. My father was calling out my name. I never turned around and looked back. I was heading straight for the manse, and I still remember leaping into my mother's arms, quite breathless, trying to tell her about this old man who was going to take me away. That dear old man, I feel very sad for him. I certainly didn't get the joke. Christmas. Christmas was the best time for children, particularly Christmas Eve. There are no photos in the church of Christmas, which is a bit sad. We would have a party over in the children's home, play games and that, and then we'd tell the nativity story, sing our songs. And then, right at the end of the night, we knew on Christmas Eve everybody was going to get their own bag of honey biscuits. You have no idea how precious those honey biscuits were. Every child got their own bag, you didn't have to share, and for some of the children that would be their only Christmas gift. So that was the highlight. Now, the most memorable weekend at Koonibba was the Jubilee celebrations of the church. The VIP guest was the Governor, Sir Edric Bastian, and Lady Bastian, his wife. And what a show Koonibba put on for them. The marching girls were spectacular. There was a spear throwing competition. There was also a boomerang competition, and when that was on, you watched and you got ready to duck, because not all those boomerangs were going to come back. The Yalata mob came and performed a corroboree, and there was just so many sporting events. And of course, the high point of the weekend was the Jubilee service in the church. My father drove a Volkswagen. A lot of people were amazed that our family of 8 could squeeze in and out of that car. We travelled long distances from Koonibba to family at Blyth and Adelaide, but that is not the reason why this car is legendary. One weekend on the Saturday, a group of children of varying ages, with the knowledge and consent of their parents, set off to go walk about for the day and headed off into the bush. By late afternoon, they had not returned, and as darkness fell, their parents came up to the mounts to see my father. They were quite worried. So my father and one of the men set off in the Volksy to search for them. Eventually, they found them, and that car returned to carrying 2 adults, 16 children, and 1 dog, and that's why that car is legendary. There is another aspect to this, my father's car. In 2010, at one of the centenary celebrations, Peter Miller told a story about how he and some of the others would have confirmation lessons in the car with Pastor as he drove to outlying preaching places. They realised over time if Pastor asked a question and they were very, very quiet, sometimes he would doze off to sleep and they wouldn't have to answer the question. Well, we hadn't heard this before, a little bit puzzled. My father never had an accident in this vehicle. And then in 2012, I was delighted to catch up with Grace Wilch, nee Harnett, on a Fish and Mission trip. Now, Grace Harnett was the nursing sister at Koonibba when I was there. I told Grace about Peter Miller's story, and she said, oh yes, she said it was common knowledge that Pastor Eckermann would doze off while he was driving. There was a well-known saying they had, when Pastor Eckermann went to sleep, the angels drove the car. That Volkswagen did a lot of travelling. The up-the-road services meant starting by sunrise, heading up to Kelowna Station, Koonibba, Fowler's Bay, Bookabee, and at the woolshed sometimes there would be 40 or 50 for a church service. And then Koonibba had the down-the-line trips where church services were provided for those residents living in southern Eyre Peninsula. Places included Malti, Nungicompata, Kimber, Port Augusta, Toology, Cummins, Mount Hope, Port Lincoln. And there's 2 red dots right up the top, usually at least twice a year or maybe 3 times. My father also went to Andamuka and Kuba Pedy. I know my brother John got to go on one of those trips and he thought that was pretty special. I would like to mention a few Koonibba identities. Edmund, what's happened here? No. Edmund, no, I'm having trouble. Edmund Ware was the leading member of the community, a mountain of a man and a real salt of the earth. As well as being the mission stock overseer, he spent part of the year at Kelowna Station, where he was their head stockman in charge of the annual cattle muster. Colleen Tuna came from the Kelowna region. Her mother brought her to Koonibba to receive an education, and she lived at the children's home. There she is again. You could not meet a more lovely person. She was a heroine in saving some of the children when there was a fire at the children's home. Colleen became a deaconess and worked for the church in various locations associated with Aboriginal ministry. Robert Ware, Bobby Ware, son of Edmund Ware, became the first Aboriginal policeman in South Australia. Later, he held other high-profile administrative positions, including at Sir Junior. Robert Highfold became the first Aboriginal administrator at Koonibba. Now, I don't have a photo of Wayne Miller, but he was the ATSIC administrator, and using ATSIC funds, bought out plots of land so that those key family groups have their own homelands now over on the west coast. Wanda Riddle was the inaugural person heading up the Scadesco community, one of those homelands. That's a very well-run financial homeland. They run cultural camps. They have their people working in the mining companies. Pam Coleman, or Pam Miller and Nick Coleman on the other side, my hero, because she was such a good basketballer. She worked in state education and travelled all over the state at Indigenous schools. Now, Koonibba also had some colourful characters, and one of those colourful characters was Norman Wombat. Norman was a spectacular high-leaping footballer, a ruckman. He was featured in the newspapers, and his motto was, "Have you ever seen a wombat fly?" And he would taunt his opposition opponents by saying, "Have you ever seen a wombat fly? I'm going to fly right over the top of you." He had a very good singing voice, and he often led the hymn singing. It could be said, however, that Norman had an aversion to work. At some point, Norman broke his leg, not from flying too high, and they would have their weekly voluntary calls for people to help out with all the maintenance they were doing. Suddenly, Norman would be limping on his leg and saying, "Oh, my leg is really playing up. I'm sorry, I just can't help you." Problem with Norman was he couldn't remember which leg he'd broken. So one week the left leg was limping, and the next week the right leg would be limping. He was a character. Right. Behavioural standards at Koonibba were high. Koonibba could, and more than once did, go for 6 months without a breath of liquor being discernible at the mission. And the main negative was alcohol. Aboriginal people were prohibited from buying alcohol, but there were always willing whites to sell sly grog. Grog running and its impact was evident through the serious health consequences to those who drank, domestic violence and economic deprivation. If no alcohol was available, some drank methylated spirits. Now, I'd like to mention my mother, Clem Eckermann. She was renowned for her hospitality. Every church member was important to her. She had a good sense of humour, and she was a great storyteller. Her musical abilities meant she served as the church organist and was the mainstay on the piano at the social evenings at the Koonibba Hall. At Koonibba, she always took the single staff under her wing in the 1946-53 stay. She always had a single staff member boarding at the manse. She often hosted social functions for the staff to keep their spirits high, because sometimes the going was tough. She also ran the switchboard, a special out-of-bounds room in the manse with all these party lines, which meant that she was the first to know of all the local romances in the district. Born and raised as a city life here in Adelaide, Koonibba was very different, but she had no fear of the wildlife, and she often told this story. One day when Clem was away, the men came and told me they'd seen a snake go under the manse. I was really frightened because the twins were just toddlers. I had Enid Pompey helping me, and Enid said, if we put out a saucer of milk, it'll bring the snake out. Later on, I went and looked and I saw the snake's tail poking out. I went and got an axe and I called to Edith and said, right, I'll pull, you chop. I pulled, she chopped, and I was left with the snake's tail in my hand, but the rest of the snake was still under the house. Now, when the men came back later and found out what had happened, they were absolutely beside themselves. They told me that the snake was a death adder, and when I grabbed its tail, it could have easily turned around and bitten me. They said the snake would be very angry and we all had to stay inside, and eventually they did kill the snake later in the day. My mother was dearly loved by the Koonibba people, and there was an obvious joy having her present at the centenary celebrations of the mission and the church and the book launch that we had in 2010. She took part in special presentations and was kept busy signing books. My father died in 1999, so he was not with us when we went back for these centenary. Some of our friends explained it to us this way: your mother is just so special, it's like the Queen visiting. Now, my father returned in 1960 with the knowledge that a confidential commission of the church had recommended that the mission should be taken over by the government. Because the report was confidential, he was bound to silence. He fought with all his might to prevent this from happening. At one point in 1962, all the staff resigned in protest at what was being proposed. There was one member of the board who kept saying Koonibba should go to the government. The financial situation was the key, but some of the expenses from Yalata were being put on the Koonibba books. There was going to be no repeat of the national campaign of the 1920s. My father made a number of submissions based on self-determination and self-government by the Koonibba community. He wanted the people to run their community. It was time for them to be able to do that. But all those submissions were rejected by the government. The takeover went ahead implementing an assimilation policy, which my father described as the crassest, we know what's best for you. Assimilation really meant removing families and placing them in white communities. A directive was put in place to prevent people from returning to Koonibba if they'd been away for a certain period of time. Some tragic things happened to some of those Koonibba people who were moved elsewhere. The Christ-centred approach of the church workers was sorely missed when Koonibba Mission became Koonibba Reserve. To make matters worse, under Don Dunstan in 67 and 68, the alcohol laws were changed from total prohibition to open slather, and the results were devastating. We left Koonibba towards the end of 1975, my father having accepted the call to serve the Balaclava parish. When we attended as a family the centenary celebration in 2001, the locals told us how at that time they felt abandoned by the church. My father's love for the people continued, and he started visiting those families who were displaced, which led to him, with the permission of Balaclava Parish, taking services once a month in suburban Adelaide. This culminated in the church establishing the Aboriginal Lutheran Fellowship of Greater Adelaide. My father accepted the call to serve that congregation at George Street, Therapton, from 1977 to 84. That was his final congregation before retirement, so my parents continued their service and relationship with the Koonibba community in that urban setting. Whoops, lost my page. One of the positive things to happen after the mission closed was the continued desire of the Koonibba people for their children to receive a Christian education, and that culminated in the Crossways Lutheran School opening in 1983. I would also like to just very briefly mention to you, if I can get it to work, what's happening. Okay. Okay. I'd like to mention the role of the Women's Guild of the ELCA. Their contribution to the mission was vital. From the beginning of the mission, free clothing was always available, and that clothing came from the guilds. They also provided significant amounts of foods like preserves, jams and similar, especially in drought years. Requests for food were always met by generous donations from the guild, which fed the community. Oh, we're back. Which fed the community in those leaner years. And there's Martha Sweckney-Weebish, the LWSA president, visiting Koonibba in 1961, and she caught up with lots of her childhood friends when she would come and visit, right back from when her father, Pastor Weebish, first started the mission. Now, if I'm allowed time, I would just like to talk a little bit about the concept of missions being destructive. In the 1980s, we can get rid of that now. In the 1980s, my father had many visits from a Dr. Peggy Brock, an expert on Aboriginal matters. She argued this point unsuccessfully. She still went ahead and published a book called Outback Ghettos and had the audacity to put a picture of Koonibba on the front cover. I've seen posters with information about Koonibba that is totally false. When my father gave evidence to the 1995 National Inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal children, the advertiser did their very best to paint that as the church splitting families and children being stolen. My sister Ruth visited the Tate Museum in London 2 years ago. There was an Aboriginal art exhibition and she was amazed to see images of Koonibba. She was devastated when she read the accompanying text. Koonibba was one of many missions established in Australia where Aboriginal people were exposed to brutal regimes of assimilation and control after being forcibly removed from their country. Even the recent reporting of the rockets going off from Koonibba, the ABC included in their statement, children were removed from their families and placed in the home on the mission for decades. For those of us who lived at Koonibba, we know the truth and we know what the community was like. The pastoral era began on the west coast in the 1860s. There were 40 years of contact between whites and Aboriginal people before the mission started. Basic things like wearing clothes was well established. The mission provided a cushion against the hardships of the impact of the white man and at the very least was a place of refuge for Aboriginal people. The people who lived at Koonibba chose to live at Koonibba. There was never any obligation for them to live there. There was no stolen generation at Koonibba. The home saved the children from being removed. Pastor Hoff preserved the local language, and as many of our missionaries have done in other places. For nearly 50 years, Aboriginal children received an education at Koonibba when Aboriginal children were not permitted to attend state schools. Nursing care was provided at Koonibba, and this was particularly important for childbirth. Many babies were born at Koonibba, and many women specifically went to Koonibba because they knew there was a nursing sister there and their babies were born there. And that includes Pastor Edmund Bildney, who some of you would know. But what is always overlooked and the most important question to ask is, what did the people want? And these people wanted a better life for their children. They wanted their children to be able to compete in the white man's world, and they wanted their children to be educated. The children themselves wanted that education, and the records in the early days showed that when the parents went walkabout, the children stayed at the school. They did not want to miss their classes. These people, and I particularly refer to the first generation, readily embraced the love of Jesus in their lives. In the 1960s, my father said that they still knew their culture, but as Christians, there were aspects of their culture that they no longer chose to practice. My father wrote, "It has been a rare privilege to have spent over 50 years with the Nungas and to have cherished friends among them. I and my siblings would add to that our lives have been enriched by knowing the Koonibba people," and I'll close with the final words of my father's book, "To God alone be the glory." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yes?
Thank you, and I'll check if there's any questions anybody has, and if you do, please wait until I bring the microphone there so that we can record it for the live stream. Any questions? Yes.
Thank you for that interesting presentation. And looking at the photos, Ros and I had the pleasure of spending quite a bit of time with Bobby Ware and his wife, because our children and their children were part of the little athletics groups in the various places, and we spent time together at the little athletics camps, which used to be held in January. And the other thing I can tell you, when you photo the Oval, I was an Australian rules football umpire, and being on the SANFL country panel one week in 1972, I was appointed to umpire Koonibba. So I left at 7 o'clock from the Franklin Street station, travelled overnight in Birdseye's bus, and then had breakfast and was given a motel room in Sojourner at 9 o'clock, 2 hours sleep, and then 11 o'clock knock on the door to go out to Koonibba. And
yes.
the spring inspection was really interesting because, but by half-time no one was wearing boots anyway. It was a cold day, and so there were not many people there that day, but there was lots of smoke from the fires around. And so then I think the match started earlier than normal, probably at 2 o'clock, and off we headed back to Sojourner. It was the days of 6 o'clock closing, so the umpires, the boundary umpire was they had a telegraph station not that far from Koonibba, I believe, and he ran the boundary that day with me. And when we got back, we drank as much beer as we could by 6 o'clock, and hopped in the bus at Birdseye's, got back to Adelaide at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then I went to sleep.
Right. Quite a trip.
Yeah, it's a long way away, isn't it? Any other questions? Yes?
Thank you. The bombing or atomic bombs
At Maralinga.
did they have any effect on the population at Koonibba?
No, not at all. It's interesting that within 12 months the bombs were dropping, and whether they had something to do with the sudden closure of the UAM mission there or not, but it's almost a little bit more of a coincidence that suddenly there was this urgency that the Aldeia people had to be moved, and then later on, of course, the bombs were going off, so...
Okay, any other questions? Yes?
Oh, the Bishop.
The Bishop.
Elizabeth, thank you. Outstanding presentation for us and a great encouragement. And I want to thank you especially for the ending that you gave as you highlighted the misunderstanding across the culture regarding the connection and provision for especially our sisters and brothers in the communities like Koonibba. And I want to encourage you to maintain that message. As Bishop of the Church, I run into teachers in our schools who constantly say they want to hear more of the real stories
Right.
that they can pass them on in classrooms, and they really cherish the kind of content that you've had. And I want to accentuate just two things for you to underscore the importance of what you've done. In this very archives place, just 2 years ago, we had some University of Adelaide folk talking about the missionaries Teichelmann and Schurman, and they were asked the question, what did they notice in all their research about the early German missionaries? And they said what they noticed is that the German missionaries treated the indigenous people as people,
Yes.
because they
Yes.
knew these were people for whom Christ had died, which is the message you've highlighted that the people at Koonibba knew. But I want to give you a second encouragement, that is in 2021, Noel Pearson in Hopevale, so the young man, a very capable lawyer and a person from the Wick people in North Queensland, he said exactly what you said at the end about the dislocation of church oversight of the missions, the Presbyterians and Lutherans in far North Queensland, and he highlights how much better off the people were culturally and spiritually before the takeover. And so in that book that he's written called Mission, he underscores the same message that you've given tonight. So I want to thank you for that. Bless you.
All right, thank you. Yes.
Good, just a moment.
I'm Brian Jeffries. I'm previous parish priest at Ceduna for 8 years.
Yes.
Alice Springs. Heather taught at Koonibba, my wife, for 8 years. Just, you mentioned Dr. Myrna Mueller, am I correct? And they had an aerial flying service from 1930 to 67. What about the births at Koonibba? How did that work? Because there was a hospital at Penong and there was one at Ceduna.
By 1960, all of the Aboriginal women were giving birth at hospitals. Now, Pastor Edmund Bilney was born, I think, in about 1954 or thereabouts. He was born at Koonibba. So the Aboriginal women were obviously giving birth at Koonibba over quite a long period of time. And all I know is that by 1960, and certainly when Dr. Myrna Miller came to Ceduna, things would have changed dramatically for the good for the health of the Aboriginal people there. You know, she's just considered a legend. So certainly by 1960, they were giving birth at proper hospitals. But in those much earlier years, they were giving birth at Koonibba. There was always a nursing sister there. So I can't give you much more information than that. And it could have been the case also that some of the women may not have felt comfortable going into a white hospital in the same way that when the breakthrough came that Aboriginal children could go to state schools, you'd have to be pretty brave if you were the only Aboriginal child fronting up. So it took a period of time, you know, for those things to develop. Yeah, yes. When the children's home opened, which is about 1913, there was always a nursing sister at Koonibba. And if I can just do a little story on the role of the pastors' wives played an important role in the care and nurture of the community. Now, Mrs. Weebish sailed out from the USA with her glory box full of beautiful sheets. She ripped them all up and used them as bandages to tend to the sick.
Elizabeth, just the last comment. Bishop Paul thanked you. I, from the bottom of my heart, just express appreciation, and just with knowledge of working in North Queensland with Hopevale and Alice Springs with Hermannsburg and Koonibba. Thank you for such a positive outlook.
Yeah.
Really.
I would like to say that the Lutheran Church is still held in very high regard on the West Coast. Obviously, when the mission closed, that was a bad time, but they got through that, and I'm not quite sure when Bobby Highfold became the first administrator at Koonibba, but you get to a point there where the Aboriginal community looks after themselves and the government take a back seat. The Koonibba Community Incorporated is there. All the roads at Koonibba are now all bitumenised. They've got lovely homes. In the early days, they had the stone cottages, and then when the government put some money in to build cottages, they were just tin sheds. You can imagine how hot that was, you know. Okay, anyway.
Okay, any other questions? I made a comment to Elizabeth before the meeting that I've actually called in at Koonibba once as well. And our son lives in Western Australia. He's adopted, he's part Aboriginal, and his grandmother grew up in the mission school at Koonibba. And she had quite an illustrious life in her adult years. She died in Canberra, and she was cremated, and after a service in the Lutheran Church in Canberra, her cremated remains were buried at Koonibba. And Elizabeth knew about her.
Yes, Audrey Cobby,
Yeah.
and her brother Harold was also at Koonibba. And you went to college with her? Okay, Audrey went to Canberra, and she had a very successful, high-profile career in Aboriginal affairs in Canberra. And as I said, those students who went to Concordia College, their communities have benefited greatly from having that education. When I talk about the Koonibba people, they're all around Ceduna. There's more people living off-site of Koonibba now around, but they are leaders in the fields of health, education, in the communities there, and it's lovely actually to see how they have benefited. And in 2010, we had the centenary of the church. The local people organised absolutely everything. And that was a remarkable thing, because in older days, the pastors usually were involved. And Dean Heine had a very good way of putting it, that in the older days, as the whites, the pastors, we led and they followed. Now we walked side by side with our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. And at Ceduna and the West Coast, they lead themselves, you know. So, yes.
Good, thank you. I'll call on Margaret to move a vote of thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Elizabeth, this has been an amazing night. There were so many beautiful things that happened while you were at Koonibba, and it's sad that the government sort of stepped in and stuffed a lot of things up. When my brother Robert Amt was at Concordia in 65 and 66, hello, yeah. Bobby Ware and Bobby Highfield were at Concordia with him, and I remember them. And Colleen Tuna, I think I remember too, but she's died, hasn't she?
Yes, she died quite some years ago
Yeah.
now.
Well, in 2014, Kevin and I went on a fishing mission trip to Eyre Peninsula and Koonibba and Yalata. And in Koonibba, your brother-in-law Alvin led a little devotion for us. But it was a Saturday, so there was nobody around because they'd all gone to the football.
That's right.
But I just loved listening to what you had to say, and seeing your photographs too. It's been so interesting.
I think the pictures say a lot more than my words. They take you to Koonibba and you see what it was really like.
They have both been excellent, so thank you very, very much.
All right, thank you.
Just in case you need something to drink.
It's me. very much. I'm all stuck here.
We'll need to make sure that everything works here, won't we? So I think we've all been really intrigued by the ups and downs that has occurred at Koonibba, and you've told the story very well. One other thing I perhaps should say, doesn't like me very much. Last meeting, we had our annual meeting and we elected our committee, but we haven't had a committee meeting since then to elect office bearers. So technically, we're in a holding pattern as far as office bearers are concerned, and we've got another committee meeting before our next general meeting, and by that time, office bearers will be elected. So those of us who were holding office are still temporarily, in a sense, technically, still holding office until we have our next committee meeting to elect office bearers. So thank you all for your attendance here tonight. You're most welcome to speak to Elizabeth afterwards. You're welcome to stay for supper. And are there books out there for sale too? No. I presume next meeting when Greg Lockwood will be speaking, that the Wakefield Press could be here, perhaps, to sell those books and maybe other books as well. Helen's got copies of the Hermannsburg book here. It's been very popular, and we've had to get a reprint made of it, and there's been lots of copies that have gone to government departments and to other official sources that we wouldn't have normally had copies go to. So thank you all for your attendance here tonight, and I close the meeting and welcome you to go to Church Hall for supper.
Can I just interrupt and invite all of you who are interested in history? There's a talk at Bethlehem House, which is just across the road from Bethlehem Church in Flinders Street, about the second pastor of the congregation. It was Pastor Lursell. There's a bit of quite an interesting tale there. At one stage, he was actually at loggerheads with the congregation and he was locked out of the church. And so he took the church to court. So you might find out all about that if you come along. It's Sunday, May the 3rd, Bethlehem House, and there's flyers here. It is also in, sorry? Sunday, sorry. Sunday the 4th of May. I'm thinking there's something else on the 3rd. Saturday. Sunday the 4th of May. What time? Did they tell us what time? Is it 2? 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock, Sunday the 4th of May at Bethlehem House. No charge, and you do get tea and biscuits afterwards. But it should be a fascinating talk. Apparently, and it's what's his name, Scholf? Noel Scholf is done a lot of research, found out all sorts of fascinating stuff. So I'm looking forward to finding out more, because all I know is that he was locked out of the church. But it wasn't the Bethlehem church, it was in Light Square, where he was the pastor of the congregation before they built the Bethlehem church in Flinders Street.
Good, thank you.
So I need to clarify that. But
So look, there's so many activities on. There's a German Heritage Research Group seminar at Tanunda as well in May, and it costs $50, and there's a lot of people who come up to that, and so we encourage people to go to that as well. And as I said, there's other things that are in the newsletter and other publicity as well. So there are plenty of things to do in May. Good, thank you. Well, welcome to adjourn over to the Church Hall.